thank you first of all for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here, and it's really interesting to see the first presentation also, which I think I have many links, so I hope to make the connection. Yes, so I want to talk not so much about my own work. Of course, it's part of my own work to be a professor at UDK in Berlin. But I'm not talking about the work as an artist, but I think it's also related, and I want to show like mainly works of the students today. And I want to talk, of course, about the spaces of the animals. Just one slide about my work. I'm not showing anything, any other photos, but I think what might be interested is that me as an artist, I was also originally trained as an architect. I'm very much interested in the notion of softness and the question how soft spaces could change the, let's say, interaction or communication or the way how we communicate in a space. So I'm working a lot with textiles, but also I'm interested in the broader sense, in the notion of softness, also in the sense of fragility. What does it mean to create fragile spaces? What does it mean to create a new relationship with our bodies to the space? So this is what I'm interested in my own practice, the Studio for Dialogical Spaces. For the students, maybe this I should also use as a bridge. So as I said before, I'm very much interested in this relationship between the body and the space, and this is also what we do at the class for spatial design at ODK. We are looking at the body as a living organism, so the body with all its senses, not just the visual sense, but including a multisensorial understanding of space. And when we talk about the body, we also talk about all living beings, not just the human body, but also talking about materiality as something that is alive and has an own agency, but also the nature and the urban environment. And the question that is also, of course, like referring to my own work, is always the question, where does the own body end and the space begin? So is there a boundary or is there no boundary? Like also Sloterdijk, he's saying that the exterior space doesn't exist. We are always living in an interior space. So I think this is really interesting to think about this notion of the boundary. And then in the end, of course, also the question, how are we situated with our own bodies in space and therefore also in society, and how do we shape these spaces and how do the spaces shape us on the way back. So the class that I'm teaching at UDK in Berlin since 2018 is called Class for Spatial Design and Exhibition Design, Raumklasse, Class for Spatial Design. And it's what is maybe also interesting is that this class is not situated in the architecture department, but in the visual communication department at UDK. And what we are basically dealing with is, as I said before, the question of space and the relationship to body movement, but also the question how do we interact with objects, space on it, or object, of course, in a smaller scale, the question of materiality. Then also digital space plays a certain or important role, the way how we shape our interaction and also the dialogue and communication. And what we are interested in doing at the UDK in my class is that we are basically developing experimental artistic methodologies in order to create spaces of communication. So this is, or used to be the class, or parts of the class, let's say, in 2019. So as you see, we're working a lot with the body also always, using also the body as some kind of communication, let's say, element, very important entity when we're talking about spaces of communication. So this is just a few projects from the class. I just want to show you the big variety, because we're working, of course, on the one hand, like with objects and the question, how do they materialize, but also in digital space. And the body, of course, always plays a very crucial role. I will also just give a brief introduction about the class, because I think it's important to know or to understand how we are working. So this is in our building in ODK in Berlin in Schöneberg. And I mean, it's almost the same as like here. I really liked, you know, when you showed us around today to show this open space that can change all the time. And this is also how we are also using our space. Like for the space of creation, for experimenting, for building up certain, you know, spatial installations, always trying new things. Then, yeah, always thinking also the way, you know, or the question, how do we show and communicate these spaces that we create? And I'm always also showing this slide because I think it's quite interesting. I mean, when I was trained as an architect, I studied at the Städelschule with Ben van Berkel. The practice, like around the 2002, 2004, when I was studying, it was still some kind of very visual practice because we were experimenting very much with the digital new tools, so to say, at that time. But then when I was finished with that study, I was always asking myself, so where's the body? Where's the, you know, where's the body in this whole creation part of architecture? And I thought that it's quite often treated as a kind of, or still treated as a kind of visual practice. But what I'm really interested in is the question, how can we yeah, find new methodologies in the question of how to yeah, design yeah, design or explore the experience space. And the experience space, of course, is much more complex, as we all know. So it's always related, of course, to the visual, but it's also related to the auditive, to the tactile, but also to the gustatory and the olfactory. And the question is with the students always, how do we, or how can we find new methodologies in order to create this kind of complex understanding of spatial experience? So what does it mean to, yeah, to build or to design these spaces? And this was an article that was published also a while ago in a newspaper in Berlin, talking about the class, and I liked it very much because it said that the class is situated in between all the disciplines. So all the students, it's a bachelor and master program basically, where you can study in the class. It's like many students from different backgrounds, coming from graphic design, but also coming from new media, but also coming, of course, from architecture, interior design, and like all these different disciplines coming together in the class, because I believe that we all need these, let's say, yeah, competences in order to, yeah, to think about this complexity of spatial design. So what we do in the class is, of course, we do exhibition design, but I call it like rather experimental exhibition design in different contexts. Also, sometimes we are designing exhibitions that are worn on the body, not made for institutions, but maybe even like for public spaces and so on. Challenging this boundary, you know, also between the public and the private space. But then also thinking about narrative spaces, we're creating body and instruments, apparatuses, but also, yeah, thinking about this boundary between the functional objects, so to say, the furniture piece, but also the sculpture, yeah, and so on. So just a few examples of the class. I won't say much about these, it should just give an overview, you know, thinking about, yeah, the notion of the body, also the figure, the stereotype in digital software tools, thinking about furniture objects that would change our behavior or things that we can wear in order to yeah, think about our relationship that we have to somebody else or also to the space that we inhabit. Thinking about different materialities that are probably not so common. Then also combining new media or new media environments to physical objects in space. And then also, of course, building like one-to-one prototypes, exploring them with our own bodies, and then also doing publications or realizing like, yeah, larger, how do you call them, like big installation that you can immerse yourself. Thinking about the question of typography in space, the role of public space, of landscape. Then also thinking a lot about performative spaces and the role of the body, you know, not thinking as something, a space that is like fixed and static, but rather think as space as something that we perceive always in space and in time. And then also thinking about, you know, different spaces and different scales that we are then also realizing the projects. So these are just a few images, more images about some exhibitions that we did. And then, of course, always thinking about different methodologies of drawing, also showing things. And then, translating things also, of course, a lot still into physical models. So the art university for us at Raumklasse is really something where we are not really making the separation between the applied and the artistic, or the experimental and the applied. So for us it goes all together. And I found it interesting that we were already talking about, the notion of the body before, or that you were mentioning it. Because, this video that I want to show you now, you won't see any animal yet. You will see them soon. But in this project, we basically read the book The Machine Stops by E.M. Forster. I don't know if you know that book. It's really interesting. It's from 1909, very old. And in the book, the humans are basically living underneath the earth. And the only way how they survive is basically that they have a machine that is taking care of them. So when you read this book, you suddenly realize, okay, this was back in, he invented this world in 1909, but he's basically talking about the digital space, or the digitalization that is affecting our lives today. And this project by Jonas Molnik and Paulina Grand is basically imagining this machine taking care of the humans as some kind of like mother, let's say. And they created this space. I don't know about the sound. Is it working? Where can I find the sound?
Take is a reminder that I am here, watching over you with endless devotion. Rest peacefully in this moment, feeling the complete safety of my presence. You are safe, always protected, always cherished.
And another work from that series of The Machine Stops was this work by Nelly Möller and Seo Jung Park, who were basically looking at, and this is again also interesting because we're looking at this like office space. So they were looking basically at the role of capitalism and the way how we work in offices, and the way how we are slowly distancing ourselves from the product that we are generating. So it's basically this gigantic landscape of office space, where everything that is produced in the end like vaporizes into air. So the people don't really know anymore what they are producing. And also, of course, as you can see, there's no human left anymore in this space. So the body is basically completely neglected. Yes, and so it continues. So, so why am I showing all these projects? Of course, they're also linked to this question of the spaces of the animals. And as a key historical anchor for this project, it was important for us also to understand that this, of course, that capitalism and modernity also were the point where this increasing, alienation between humans and animals happened. So, and what we did, and it was a semester project back in 2024 that we did for 4 months of the semester, working on that project. And basically, students were also picking actually like an animal that they wanted to do research about and that they wanted to explore. And the idea was basically to tell stories, to develop new narratives for these animals that in the end might also offer opportunities for reconnection, resistance, and also reimagination, coexistence. And what we designed in the end were basically, on the one hand, of course, digital, spaces, but then also the idea was to bring them into like some kind of model, like sculpture, strange furniture, or also cross-media installations. Just a few images. I will jump into these works a little bit later. So this was the works, how we showed them in the end in the classroom. Then, of course, like very interesting books that you probably also all know. And then we also organized a lecture series, inviting, for instance, Denise Reitan, who did a mask workshop with us about metamorphosis. I will also show the examples later on. Then, I don't know if you know this building, the Mäusebunker in Berlin. It's really interesting. It used to be like a former laboratory for animals. And then we also invited Arianna Ferrari, who's a researcher and who really wrote an interesting book about the dualism of humans or why this dualism exists between humans and animals. This was just a little example of the process of the students, because right now, of course, I'm mainly showing like final projects. Into one project I will dive a little bit more closely. And the starting point was basically this workshop that I just mentioned by Denise Reitan, who's originally coming from jewelry design. But we were developing objects for the body that would be some kind of like masks for the students to imagine what kind of animal they were interested in. So this workshop was only for 1 day. And the questions that we gave to the students were these, like, for instance, which animal would you like to be? Which animal are you afraid of? Which animal do you love? Which animal do you find disgusting? Which animal do you feel sorry for? Which animal would you like to dream about? Was there a special experience between you and an animal? Do you have a magical animal? Which animal would you like to, or do you encounter again and again? So these were just questions for the students, and they could just intuitively decide for which question they want to go. And then 2 students were always like working together and creating these masks. And the masks were basically hybrids between 2 animals always. So this was the very starting point for the semester. The project was also published in several magazines. And here you see like a few examples of the animals, like for instance, on the left-hand side, it's a fox, a rat, and a beaver, or the hybridization of a mosquito, spider, and praying mantis, or the rabbit, the moth, butterfly, and the bat. Or the deer, the snake, the mountain goat, the pig, dog, cow, and the sheep, and the seahorse, and the tardigrade on the right-hand side. And then we also asked the students not just, to show their masks in the photo studio, but also to really find their habitat in the city. And that's why they were also like walking around in the city like this. And of course, for the students it was really interesting because due to the mask, they could just do things that they probably weren't afraid of doing beforehand. So to really stretch this boundary between the private body, let's say, and the public space, and to really also find and appropriate the space that they want to inhabit. So as I said, this was a starting point, and then from this workshop, of course, many students already found some interest in their animal that they wanted to do research of. And so of course I cannot go into all the projects right now because we don't have that much time. As I said, I will focus on to one, but I want to give you an short overview of all of them. Here you see, just on the website, you can click on each of the projects if you want to go deeper, and then all the research also unfolds for all the different projects. But this one was really interesting. It was basically about the mouse. And as Elsa and Olivier, they were looking or challenging the ethical norms through a Bosch-inspired spatial narrative, investigating the hidden habitat of a mouse in a domestic home. So basically, they were creating some kind of landscape for a mouse, some kind of habitat, like a mini house for a mouse from the mouse perspective. And then this was also the spatial installation in the end that they created. Or then there's this, and now I will only show like one image per project, to look at a fox with the loving eyes by Malte Andersen and Justus Ratzke, which is a reflection on the empathy and perception in human-animal relationships, looking at foxes in Berlin's urban space. I don't know about how in Geneva, do you have foxes here in the city? Yes? So in Berlin, you see them all the time, basically during the day, so they just encounter you. So they were interesting in this, and then they translated this, the fox kind of landscape, urban landscape, into some kind of spatial installation where the fox would always like appear and disappear as an encounter. Or this really interesting work by Jason Kidner and Marek Schmiese that was basically dealing with a comparison between the eel and the pig. Also really interesting one because they were looking into this poetic inquiry and the myth and the similarities, and just finding or constructing new similarities between the pigs and the eel, but also the differences. And then Hikari Tanaka, Shinae Kim, and Veronika Froch focusing on the identity and interspecies resonance of swarm animals. And then there's also the work by Ezra Alvarez and Artemisa Astolfi looking at the worm, the woodworm. Then there was the work of Lukas Barovic and Annalisa Senius looking at rats, and they created like this big installation made from tubes and gutters, basically telling the story of the rat and its living environment underneath our feet in the city. And then Distant Intimacy by Teresa Carreta, Till Fehn, and Sarah Abid, looking at the octopus. They were basically looking at the emotional closeness across species, exploring also the fascinating hybridity of the octopus. And the name with no horse was looking at horses, specifically race horses. And the, let's say, I mean, they have names, but on the other hand, they are very much objectified as sports instruments almost, you could say. And this was the interest of Sandy Park and Victoria Alice Stegmann. In this work, I want to show you a little bit in more detail Subterranean Saga by Aisha Ram and Paulina Sepp. And they were exploring the habitat or the stories and narratives about the rabbit. So as you probably still remember, this was their mask that they created. So they found like immediately the animal that they were interested in, the rabbit. And I can only show you parts of the research because a lot of things that they did and explorations and drawings and experiments. But it was interesting because they found out that basically the rabbit in pop culture, on the one hand, is, you know, a very cute animal. But it has also different notions, like it's also a sex symbol if you think about the Playboy, or if you think, for instance, about like horror movies or trick films, sometimes it's even barbaric. So they were looking at all these different, let's say, personality contrasts in different contexts of the rabbit. Then this was also part of the research. They were looking at the rabbit's habitats, for instance, also, of course, husbandry methods. Like, of course, the wild animal is living in nature, but then you have the pet living at home, you have the laboratory animal, and you also have the slaughter animal. They were also looking at some kind of like spatial organizations, like the rabbit burrow in a natural habitat, which is very organic, but then on the other hand, you have this laboratory and farm animal housing on the other hand, which is very kind of like, you know, rigid, grid-like, and so on. And what they wanted to do, they were also looking at the rabbit hole as something, you know, that is like hidden underneath ground. And they wanted to conceal the true nature, let's say, of a building of a rabbit. And as I said, they were looking also at Alice in Adventures in Wonderland, when she was basically going down a rabbit hole and exploring a new world or finding a new world. So they got really interested in this idea of the tunnel system. So something that is happening above ground, but also, you know, there's some kind of like one side of the rabbit maybe happening on the outside. And then going into this portal, going inside, and then finding this tunnel system going underground, and then showing the other side of the animal, which is probably like really technoid, dystopian, and concealing. So these were all the different topologies of the rabbit husbandry that they were inspired by looking at. The different typologies of also the materialities, of course. And then they started to, you know, find like visualizations to show this idea of on the one hand, you know, this like very adorned outside, let's say, that is almost like a Baroque garden, telling like a fantastical story about the sweet animal and so on, about the sweet rabbit. But then also, the inside that probably has a different kind of spatial atmosphere. So in this visualization or collage, you see, you know, the outside and the inside as a kind of concept or what they wanted to realize. Then they, of course, built like, you know, digital models to show this idea of the, or the question, how can we enter also this inside? Because in the end, it was clear that it shouldn't be only digital, but also physical sculpture, let's say, or object that is telling the story. So they also had to think about these mechanisms, how to enter, how to open. And then, because I said, I mean, the task was also to bring it into the physical world. They were then building this object or installation or sculpture and with all these like really nice details, you know, the rabbit, I mean, you wouldn't see the rabbit as a big like animal somewhere, but it was always hidden in these details, like in the adornment of the columns and so on. And they were building it in the model building workshop at ODK, in our house, in our building. And then, of course, there was also the hidden interior that you could enter through looking into certain holes of this structure. And then you would see like this other notion of the animal that is an animal that is very much afraid, you know, that is tortured, the laboratory animal inside. So you would see also the eye of the animal looking at the eye of the rabbit. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.